be seated. There was a book written many years ago which is considered something of a spiritual classic by the great spiritual writer Henry Nouwen, and the title was With Open Hands. And it was a collaborative book with photographs and commentary on the whole notion of open hands. And it's a great look at the symbols that are contained with the difference between open hands, which are receptive, capable of receiving from another. So the openness that we experience when, you come to the door of your parents' home and your mother welcomes you and opens her arms, and you know that you're going to get a nice hug, embrace, versus coming towards someone that has a clenched fist. And the reaction to that is quite stark and different. Theirs is a defensive posture, defending what is mine, maybe even indicating violence that is to come. And so perhaps hands can be an entry point into understanding today's gospel. And let me begin with a story. It's a story about a man who went on a safari in Africa, and he was on a hunting expedition, and so he awoke one morning at sunrise, and he went into the jungle to hunt, and he happened to shoot a couple of wild turkeys. And as he was coming back to the camp, he encountered a small African boy, maybe 12, 13 years of age, and it was obvious that this boy was starving to death. I mean, this boy barely had the strength, the energy to run, much less walk. So he couldn't understand what he was saying, but he kept gesturing to the man, and it became obvious that he wanted the turkeys. And so the hunter attempted to give him the turkeys, and he refused. And finally, when the young man opened his arms, he realized that he could only receive the gift of meat as a gift. He could not take it from him. He could not take it from him. That is, as hungry as he was, it was only with a posture of openness and open hands could he receive this gift from the hunter. And finally, he was led to believe, and he placed them in his open hands. So today's gospel contains the parable of the dishonest steward and a series of sayings on wealth. And this is a very difficult parable to interpret. What is Jesus trying to get at in this parable? The key is the steward's desire to act in such a way as to be welcomed into his former clients' homes. Remember in Luke's gospel, in chapter 14, Jesus exhorts his listeners to welcome the poor and crippled into their homes, to welcome the poor so that you can't expect to be returned with a banquet in their home. Welcome them. And then he follows this with the telling of the parable of the great dinner, to which the poor and the crippled are invited, that the master will not be satisfied until the banquet hall is full of guests. And then in chapter 15, we last week heard the wonderful parables about the one lost sheep and the one lost coin, and we didn't hear the parable of the prodigal son, but in that story, the son who wasted all of his inheritance is welcomed home by his father. There seems to be a connection in Luke's gospel between whom one welcomes and what a person must do to be welcomed. What is Jesus driving at? What is the point he's trying to make? It has been suggested that the steward doesn't really defraud the master. He does, however, forego his commission. We are already told that he was dishonest, which he doesn't deny. What the steward does in order to be welcomed into other people's homes is to give up everything he has and everything he previously depended upon for support. In other words, he's operating in a crisis mode. He's about to be dismissed. And so he's trying to figure out how he can be welcomed into his former clients' homes. And the master's approval bears on the prudence of the manager who uses material possessions to ensure his future stability. And likewise, the prodigal son is welcomed home again by the father, and so enters the feast because he has lost everything. And he returns home empty-handed. And he can only be received by the father because he has allowed himself to become vulnerable, which is what the posture of open hands reveals. How can we be vulnerable? The older brother, on the other hand, with his hands full of years of service and obedience, with clenched fist, holding on to all that he has done for his father, stands outside the banquet hall and is unable to enter in. And so those who are empty-handed, with open hands, it seems, are welcomed into the banquet hall, are welcomed into the kingdom of God. A person can ultimately come to God's banquet only if that person is empty-handed, with open hands. And so we have the example of Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all, as Paul says. This transaction took place at the very point in time when Jesus had no assets, no collateral, no credit, nothing. And he was able to offer himself to the Father. There's a story about a rector of an Episcopal church, and he had a parishioner, Stan, who sat in the front pew, and every time he began to preach, Stan would go to sleep. Never failed. And this aggravated the rector to no end, and finally he brought it up to his vestry, and he decided that he was going to get the last word with Stan. And so he told him his plan. And so the very next Sunday, after the vestry approved of his plan, he began preaching, and sure enough, Stan fell asleep. And so according to his plan, he whispered to the congregation, "Everyone who wants to go to heaven, please stand up." So everybody stood up, except Stan, who was asleep. And then he says, "And everyone who wants to go to hell, please stand up." And Stan was startled, and he stood up, And Stan said to the rector, "I don't know what we're voting on, but it looks like you and I are the only ones for it." And so the parable is a challenge by Jesus to his listeners and to us to make a drastic decision for the coming of the kingdom of God, to stand up and be counted. You know, we're in a crisis mode, to let go of mortal interest, to let go of the material concerns of our lives that take up so much of our energies, and to set our sights on the life and the salvation of the kingdom of God, which it has pleased the Father to give us. It has pleased the Father to give us the kingdom of God. And we can only accept it with open hands, with that open posture. And so as disciples of the risen Christ, we are faced with a similar crisis by the kingdom preaching of Jesus. Considering this crisis, we are called to the prudent use of material possessions. And so there's a proper meaning and use of material goods. When Jesus speaks of using wealth to make friends who will provide a lasting reception when the world's goods fails, what he's saying is get your values straight. It's kind of like Jesus is issuing a call to some sort of value clarification, distinguishing between ends and means, that money is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. That people come first. Money should be used to help others. Money is only useful, Jesus seems to be saying, when it's given away, when it's used properly for the building of the human community, for building up the human community of love. From the perspective of the kingdom, it is this which is lasting. And so the gospel story and its subsequent reflection is telling us that we need help in keeping spirit alive. And so we live in a culture that puts so much emphasis on material possessions, and it can be killing to the soul, killing to the spirit. And so what can we do to alleviate this soul-killing culture that we live in? And so if we ourselves are in the mode of spiritual survival, what can we do? We can make a commitment to live spiritually. Just the act of making the commitment to live a spiritual life will enable us to keep that commitment. And you do that, by your coming to church every week in and week out. You're coming to the Eucharist. You're receiving the body and blood of Christ. You're saying yes to that. You're saying yes to making a spiritual commitment to live your life for God. And to aid us in that commitment, we should make friends with people who are spiritually thriving. And so look around. Who are your friends? Are they spiritually thriving? It's often called making friends with someone who values the essence of life. And we all need at least one or two essence friends in our lives, people who value the same things that we do. And so having those people whose values are clarified through the lens of the kingdom of God can help us on our spiritual journey. And we can also strive to have a beginner's mind and ask the Spirit to enhance that attitude on a daily basis. In other words, take a first-time attitude toward life. And so the next time you view a sunset, think of it as, I'm viewing this sunset as if this is the first time I have ever seen it. And open yourself up to the reality of this miracle, the gift of another day. There's another African story about Africans who would emerge from their huts upon waking, and they would immediately leave their huts, and when they first realized that they were awake, they would take that first breath and they would hold it. And then they would go and face the rising sun and let that breath go, greeting the day as if it was the first day of their life, not taking it for granted. Or your significant other who walks into the room and you take a first-time attitude and you look at that person as if that's the first time I ever saw her face. Isn't there even a song? First time ever I saw your face. Or look in the eyes of your grandchild and think, what was it like to look at this face for the very first time? And so don't go to sleep. Don't live your life as if you and I are asleep. Live our lives completely awake to the reality of this kingdom preaching of Jesus. And so when we invest attention, our spirit flows into what we are doing, and it returns to us more spirit. Spirit is the reality that when given away, there is more of it. Spending spirit is the best way to enhance spirit. Spending love is the best way to enhance love. There is no limit to love and its capacity to renew itself in the life of God's people. And we see this attitude in the way Jesus died. The Jesus code, if you will, the hidden secret that love is most truly revealed in the brokenness of Jesus on the cross. Jesus died innocent, trusting, unwilling out of love to protect himself against suffering, refusing to give back in kind, and refusing to give himself over to bitterness and resentment.